Hello, welcome to a new episode of Fairy Tales with Jen. It has been so long since I filmed one of these. I realised that I hadn't uploaded one since last August, then felt incredibly guilty and decided I needed to rectify that ASAP. So if you're new here, hi, my name is Jen. I'm an author. I've written these books, which are found in all the usual places in bookshops, and I'll also link them in the description box down below. I love fairy tales. I love looking at the history of fairy tales, how twisted and weird they are, and when they also relate to true events, well, that just pleases me even more. I have a whole series on my channel called Fairy Tales with Jen, which I'll link in the description box down below, where I delve into the histories of particular fairy tales. And today we're going to be looking at the history of Snow White. Snow White was popularised, along with many other tales that we know today, by the brothers Grimm. Wilhelm and Jacob were collating stories to preserve their own language, and the first edition of these stories were published in 1812, and there were 7 subsequent editions that they revised. They were heavy revisionists, and the final one was published in 1848. It's the 1848 versions that are mostly translated, especially into English, and it was only a few years ago that Jack Zipes, who is a folklorist, translated the original 1812 editions. Over those decades, when they revised the tales, they became more sanitized and more Christian, so some of the gore was lost in translations. It's these later translations that were also used as inspiration for Walt Disney films, and of course Disney has a huge monopoly on fairy tales these days and the romanticization of fairy tales. I'm assuming for the purpose of this video that you're all familiar with the 1930 Disney version of Snow White, so I'm not going to linger there. We're going to go straight to the 1812 Grimm edition and then dart off in various directions from there, including diving into some true history. The 1812 edition of the Grimm Snow White is not that different to Walt Disney, but first off, it's not an evil stepmother, it's an evil mother. This is true for most fairy tales where there's an evil stepmother. The original, and I use that in quotes because, as you know, it's impossible to trace the original version of any tale pretty much, but in the older tales it tends to be an evil mother, and then that was deemed too unchristian and it was switched to an evil stepmother. That's certainly what the Grimms did as they revised their tales over the decades. This evil mother has a mirror that she talks to. She asks the mirror who is the prettiest girl in all of the land, and the mirror says that her daughter is. So very annoyed, the mother says that she wants her daughter dead. She orders a huntsman to kill her and bring her her liver and her heart. She wants to eat it on a plate. The huntsman doesn't want to kill Snow White, so instead he kills an animal, brings those organs back too, and Snow White flees to a cottage in the woods. This cottage in the woods had 7 men inside. In some versions they're called dwarves, and this is thought to be inspired by miners. So miners in these times were often young children who were forced to work from a very young age. They could get into spaces that adults just simply couldn't get into, and because they worked from such a young age, they grew up to have disfigurements and disabilities because of the way their bodies were forced to contort for work. The Queen, of course, finds out that Snow White is not dead because she's still consulting her mirror, and she goes several times to Snow White's house, and then she dresses up as an old woman and appears with an apple that she has poisoned on one side, and she tempts Snow White to eat it. She tempts her by saying it's okay by eating the side that isn't poisoned, and then Snow White eats the poisoned side and falls down as if dead. The men in her house don't want to bury her, so they keep her in a glass coffin. And then a prince appears. A prince comes, and there is no magic kiss. This is what I find so interesting and creepy about this tale, and it's a motif that you can find in so many other fairy tales that I've already covered, like Sleeping Beauty, etc. The prince appears and he sees a sleeping or dead girl in a glass coffin, and he falls in love with her, and he says to the men that he wants to take this girl home. Now, the men aren't that happy about it, but they agree that maybe he can take her. So the prince takes Snow White home. People carry her coffin to his castle, and they carry the coffin around several rooms as he's trying to find out the best place to put her. The best place to put this woman who is asleep or dead, who he can't communicate with, but is in love with. It's not okay. Finally, one of the men who is carrying the coffin is so annoyed by having to lug this dead weight around between rooms that he opens the coffin and he slaps Snow White's face, at which point a piece of apple that was lodged in her throat is coughed up. She wakes up. The prince hopefully is happy that she's awake. I don't know, marries her, and at the wedding her mother appears and she is forced to wear iron shoes and dance on hot coals until she dies. So that's a brief summary of the 1812 Grimm edition, but of course the tale goes back further than that and branches out in many different directions. And I want to talk to you about some of my favourites. There will be a brief mention of sexual assault, just to let you know. That is often the case in fairy tales, sadly. We can see vague similarities between the tale of Adam and Eve being tempted to eat the forbidden fruit, which got them thrown out of the Garden of Eden. Women, eh? But we can also see similarities between the Roman and Greek myth of Chione. Chione means snow, and she was supposed to be a most beautiful goddess. So beautiful, in fact, that two gods fell in love with her. Apollo, and depending on whether you're reading the Greek or Roman version, Mercury/Hermes. But this is not the romantic kind of love that we would hope would be in this tale. We've all been around fairy tales and myths to know that that is hard to come by. So Mercury/Hermes puts her to sleep and then rapes her. Afterwards, Apollo dresses up as an old woman, seduces her, and then rapes her too. After this, Chione is shouting from the rooftops that she has made two gods fall in love with her, and that makes her the most beautiful goddess around. Again, depending on whether you're reading the Greek or Roman version, it is at that point that Diana and or Artemis take great issue with this and decide they're going to shoot Chione through the heart with an arrow. Fairy tales can be categorised and put inside a table called the Aaron-Thompson Index. Snow White is type 709 in that table. There are many different variants of the 709 type tale, including Myrtle, which is a Greek fairy tale, Gold Tree and Silver Tree, which is a Celtic tale, and Bella Venetia, which is an Italian tale. But today, I want to talk about my favourite Snow White versions that could have inspired the Grimm's tale. One of my favourites is a long form Malay poem called Syair Bidasari, and it was popular in the 18th century. It's about a young girl who was found by a merchant in a basket floating down a river, and by her side in the water was a fish, and the merchant realised that this young girl's life relied on the fish. If he took the fish out of the water, then she stopped breathing. He decided he wanted to adopt her and take her home, so he scooped out the fish in a vase and took the fish home safely along with the girl so that they could continue to exist together. In the same kingdom, a king married a queen. This was his second wife. This wife secretly practices witchcraft and she has a magic mirror. She asks the mirror who is the most beautiful girl in all the land. Normally it says her, but it starts to say Bidasari. The queen tracks down Bidasari and finds her and forces her to come to work in her palace. She makes her scrub the floors, clean everything. She's hoping that if she makes her work really hard, that her beauty will fade. But it doesn't. So the queen decides instead she's going to burn her face. She's going to set it alight. But when she sets the girl's face alight, it doesn't hurt her at all and the fire magically goes out. Bidasari is of course very traumatized by all of this and she says, "Please don't hurt me. My life is reliant on a fish that's kept at home. You can't kill me unless you kill the fish." I don't know why you would volunteer this information, Bidasari. It was a mistake. It was a mistake. The queen, of course, goes to track down this fish, takes it out of its water, at which point Bidasari falls down as if dead, and the queen places the fish in a locket that she keeps around her neck. The queen tells Bidasari's adoptive father that she died at work. The man is, of course, distraught, takes her home, builds a tomb, and puts her inside it. Meanwhile, the queen's stepson has been having visions of Bidasari. He feels like he's in love with this girl and he's never even met her. Then he finds a painting of her, asks who she is told that she has died and decides he's going to go and visit her tomb. So he goes to her tomb and when he's there, Bidasari wakes up. And I love this. She wakes up because the queen is currently taking a bath and the fish has fallen out of the locket into the bathwater and is suddenly alive again. So for that short moment in time, Bidasari is also alive again, and she tells the prince what has happened, that his stepmother has killed her and she needs that fish back in order to live. At which point the queen grabs the fish, puts it back in the locket, and Bidasari falls back into sleep/death once again. It's so riveting. The stepson then goes back to his stepmother. She denies everything. They fight. He kills her. He releases the fish from the locket, puts it in water. Bidasari wakes up and they're all married and they live happily ever after. The end. Speaking of epic poems, another epic poem was called Padmavat, which was recorded in 1540 in an Eastern Hindi language called Awadhi. And in this tale, there was no talking mirror, but there was a talking parrot. I'll link it in the description box down below. It's not one I'm going to go into detail here, but you know, I thought I'd mention it because we all love a talking parrot. Instead, I'm going to tell you about an Armenian tale called Nourie Hadig. Now, Nori was the daughter of a man and a beautiful woman, and every month the beautiful woman, who was the mother of this child, would go to the moon and ask the moon who was the most beautiful woman in the land. And the moon always said that she was, until one day the moon started saying, actually, it's your daughter. Outraged, the woman runs to her husband and tells him that he must kill their daughter because she's becoming beautiful. The father isn't that happy about killing his daughter, so he pretends he's done it and instead chases her into the woods and says, "You must go find your own way now." So Nori does, and she goes into the forest and she finds a hut. And inside this hut, she finds a sleeping prince and a room full of treasure. And there's a voice in this hut that tells her that she must care for this prince for the next 7 years. So she does. The queen, however, knows that her husband didn't kill their daughter because she keeps asking the moon who is the most beautiful woman in the world, and it keeps saying, "It's your daughter." So she's outraged still, and she treks through the land trying to find her daughter, but she doesn't stumble across the hut where her daughter is staying. After 7 years, the prince wakes up and he falls in love with Nori and asks her if she will marry him. She says yes, and it's at this point that the queen finds out where her daughter is, because when she next asks the moon who is the most beautiful woman in all the land, the moon says the princess of Adana. So the queen goes to the court with a ring that she has made that, spoiler, causes death, and she says to her daughter, "I'm so sorry that I ever tried to have you killed. Please accept this ring as an offering of my apology." And Nori, because she's lovely and naive, takes the ring and she puts it on her finger, at which point she falls down as if dead. Her mother flees. Everyone runs to Nori's side. The prince says he's not going to bury her. He says he's going to put her in a glass coffin and look after her and care for her in the same way that she did for him when he was randomly passed out in a hut in the middle of the forest. So that's what he does, and he hires lots of doctors to come and look at her and see if they can wake her up. One doctor tries to take off the ring on her finger because he wants to steal it, but as he starts taking the ring off, he sees that Nori is starting to wake up. So he quickly pushes the ring back on her finger, says to the prince, "If I can wake her up, will you give me a fortune?" The prince says yes. He pulls off the ring. Nori wakes up. She's very happy. They live happily ever after. Her mother, meanwhile, has been living happily ever after because she's been asking the moon every month who is the most beautiful, and the moon has said, "You, of course." But the next time she asks the moon says her daughter's name again, and she realises that her daughter has been saved, at which point she dies from anger. The last fairy tale that I want to mention before I move into the true history aspect of this tale is one that was actually recorded in 1900, so it's probably also inspired by the Grimm tale, but I'm sure that they share common ancestry in the threads that unite both of these stories. It's a Breton fairy tale and it's called La Petite Toute-Belle. This particular tale is about a queen's servant who's been stealing all of the queen's shit. She's been stealing all of her money, all of her jewels, and frightened that she's going to get caught, she decides that she's going to blame it on the queen's beautiful daughter. The queen, outraged as queens often are in these tales, decides that she's going to tell the servant to get rid of her daughter. And the servant says, "Don't worry about it, ma'am. I will take her out to a cliff and I will push her off a cliff." And the queen says, "Good, please do that. Thank you very much." So the servant lures the princess out of the castle on a mission to find a cliff to push her off, and en route she stumbles across a well and she thinks, well, that'll do too. So she says to the princess, "Look, down there, it's a beautiful flower," and the princess peers over the edge of the well, the servant pushes her in, and the princess falls down. The princess, however, doesn't drown because at the bottom of what is supposed to be a well isn't actually a well, so she doesn't fall into water, she falls into this beautiful room filled with jewels, and do you know what else is in that room? I bet you can't guess. I'll give you 3 seconds. It's dragons. That wasn't 3 seconds, sorry, I got excited. It's dragons. There are 3 dragons at the bottom of this well because, I mean, why not? So the princess is there, she's hanging out with these 3 dragons, and the next day the servant walks past the well and the princess shouts, "Hi, I'm still here. Could you maybe rescue me, please?" And the servant, realising that the princess is still alive, goes back and tells the queen, "I'm really sorry, but I thought I'd killed her, but I hadn't." So the queen says, "Okay, here are some poison sugared almonds. Go and drop those down the well." So the servant goes back to the well, drops the poison sugared almonds over the side and says, "Here's some sustenance for you. I'll go get a bladder and get you out." But the dragons see these poisoned sugared almonds and say, "Don't eat those, girl. Those are poisoned sugared almonds." So she doesn't eat them. The servant goes back to the queen and says, "I'm really sorry, but she didn't eat the sugared almonds." And the queen says, "That's okay. I had this poisoned dress made. Look how shiny it is." So the servant takes this poisoned red dress to the well and drops it down. The dragons aren't that au fait with human clothing, so they don't notice that this dress is poisoned, and they say, try it on. So the princess tries it on, at which point she falls down dead. The dragons are very, very sad, and they feel very bad about not noticing that this dress was poisoned, so they put the princess in a glass coffin, they lift her out of the well, they take her to the seaside, and they bury her at sea. They push this glass coffin into the waves, and they wave farewell with their dragon handkerchiefs. Now, her glass coffin washes onto the shore of another kingdom, and she's found by a prince who's just walking along the shore. And he finds this girl in a glass coffin who's passed out in a red dress, and he thinks, I'm gonna take her home with me. Again, it's not really okay. So he takes her home and he decides to get her naked, this passed out woman that he has just found on the beach. And when he takes off her dress, she wakes up and the spell is broken, and she doesn't focus on the fact that this man has got her naked in this strange place that she doesn't know. She's just so grateful, and she says, let's get married. So they do. Oh, and her mother is burned at the stake. The end. So that was fun. Let's now look at the true aspects of the history of Snow White. In 1994, a report was published by someone called Eckhart Sander, who argued that Snow White was based on the real life of a countess born in 1533 called Margaretha von Waldeck. Margaretha's father owned several copper mines, and her mother passed away. Her father then remarried a woman called Katharina, who reportedly hated her stepchildren and much favoured her own biological children. She also hated Margaretha because she was very, very beautiful. So she decided when Margaretha was 16 to send her away to Brussels, where she didn't have to look at her anymore. Whilst in Belgium, Margaretha garnered the attention of many gentlemen who thought that she was beautiful, but she only had eyes for one, who was called Philip and would later become the Prince of Spain. Margaretha then died very mysteriously at the age of 21, and it's reported that she was poisoned. Among the suspects are the King of Spain, who was very annoyed about the relationship she had with his son because he didn't think it was a good political match. I love this one. Another real-life claim to the throne of Snow White is Maria Sophia van Erthal, who was born in Bavaria in Law in 1729. She was born in a house that was surrounded by 7 hills, and then her mother died. Her father then remarried a woman called Claudia, who apparently wasn't very nice at all. Claudia had a talking mirror. Now, there are various reports of this. Some people really romanticize it and say it was a talking mirror that had a box in that literally talked to you, but that's not really what it was. Bavaria was famous for its talking mirrors, and these talking mirrors were called that because they were so pure and so clear that they could only tell the truth. They often had inscriptions around the side, and Claudia's had an inscription which said self-love. And they had acoustics, so it sounded like when you spoke into the mirrors, they echoed back, hence talking mirrors. That talking mirror can still be found in their house, which is now a museum, and also in that museum is a pair of iron shoes, akin to the iron shoes that the Grimms had in their version of the Snow White tale. It is local legend in Bavaria that Claudia poisoned her stepdaughter by putting belladonna in the side of an apple and forcing her to eat it. So that's some of the fascinating history behind Snow White. I wanted to end with a side note about Alan Turing. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with Alan Turing. If not, you should be. He was a pioneering mathematician, code breaker, and amazing computer scientist who was in part responsible for helping Britain win the Second World War. After the Second World War, he was treated appallingly by the UK government when they discovered that he was gay, and they chemically castrated him. It's reported that Alan Turing was obsessed with the fairy tale of Snow White, and when he was found dead in 1954 of cyanide poisoning, a half-eaten apple was lying by his side. It's still debated whether or not today that was suicide or murder. So, that's everything that I wanted to talk to you with regard to Snow White. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you're new, please do subscribe. If you'd like to support what I do and purchase one of my books, this one is inspired by fairy tale. I will link them in the description box down below. Let's have a chat in the comment section down below, and I promise it won't be as long before I do the next episode of Fairy Tales with Jen. I hope you're having a great week. I'll speak to you very soon. Lots of bookish love. Bye.